I'd like to thank you for your presence, of all you who are in the room, and of all those who are connected through internet. COVID-19 pandemic generated a great economic process in Latin America and the Caribbean. According to the last forecast, we foresee that in 2020, the GDP of the region fell 9%. And this drop will affect the most low-income classes. So it's important to see the role that infrastructures play in the economic growth of the region and the anti-cycle effect that they can have. Investment in infrastructure attracts investment from domestic sources and from international sources. Let me share some data. The studies of the IIDB show that for each dollar of investment in infrastructure, the GDP increases in $1.5 in a period of 5 years. Another very revealing data is that recent studies signal that an increase of 5% in productivity and efficiency in the infrastructure services result in an increase of 6% of the GDP through 1 year. And the creation of employment, everybody knows, for each $1 million invested in infrastructure, 36,000 jobs are created. Therefore, now more than ever, we need infrastructure investments. But mobilizing resources and investments for infrastructure is not enough. These investments should be conducted in an efficient and sustainable way. I don't know if you knew, but this was very impressive. I think that approximately 1/3 of investments that carried out on infrastructure in the region are lost by inefficiencies. Our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, could save up to half a point of GDP annually if the infrastructure projects were conducted according to the standards demanded by the multilateral agencies. So we have to invest in infrastructures, but not in any infrastructure, in sustainable and efficient infrastructures. All of us are aware of the enormous pressures that all governments suffer and the need to attract private capital to develop infrastructure. Right now, I'm not going to explain about the importance of the role of the PPPs after 2 days talking about this subject in these talks, but I would like to take a step further and try to see what we have to do to develop a PPP that includes the creation and the development of infrastructures that are efficient and sustainable. For this, we will have to change many things. We will have to change the regulatory frameworks so that they will be updated. We will have to change the designs and projects of these infrastructures so we can incorporate sustainability criteria and climate change criteria, mitigations, adaptation, and in community integration measures and measures that favor the low-income classes. It is also important to develop private finances that will attract investors interested in these themes, like green bonds and green investments. And we have to agree and conceive and apply common criteria to define what is sustainable infrastructure. Because all of this I would like to comment with all of you in this panel. And for this, we have organized a panel with representatives of government and from the investment community and developers. We have a luxury panel that I will introduce to you now. First, we have the presence of Maia Colodenco, who is Economic Affairs Secretary in the Ministry of Economy of Argentina. Welcome, Maria Maya. We also have Christian Deseglise, the Sustainable Finance Director from HSBC. And finally, we have David Espinoza, who is Senior Principal in Biosynthesis, and we are very satisfied to have your presence here. And now let's go to the first question. Maya, I would like to ask it to you. Your work in the Ministry of Finance and in the G20 infrastructure panel is essential to know the challenges that governments are facing, but to understand what other countries are doing, how they are trying to develop these PPPs. So in this context, how do you perceive the position of these sustainable PPPs as a solution for the development of these more efficient and sustainable infrastructures? Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to the IDB for their invitation and also for the participation of the panelists. But all of us know all the changes that have taken place due to COVID-19 that has deepened the need of building sustainable infrastructure for the coming years. So we see that investments in infrastructure is the engine of economic development, and also to face climate change and to recover from the pandemic. These themes were discussed in the G20 summit. We have discussed the importance of the development of quality and sustainable infrastructure for the economic recovery and for the development of a resilient and sustainable economy. We have discussed this before the pandemic. We're discussing action to catalyze and channel PPPs. I will tell you some of the actions or ideas that have been discussed and what is being discussed still in this framework. This is an element which is very important because one of the gaps that we have, not only the financing deficit, there's thousands and thousands of millions of dollars, as you can see in the reports of Global Infrastructure House, but we also need quality projects that should be well implemented. There's a great deficit here, and there's much work to do here, and this is something that we try to address. How to improve project preparation. We were talking about principles so that governments can follow to make decisions that can develop quality infrastructure. In the presidency of Argentina for the G20 summit has made a working group that's been led by Brazil and by Australia. We have coordinated efforts with Argentina and also at the regional level, several initiatives that have been key to bring to the forum the regional and specific gaps of each region and of each country. So we have to take into account the challenges of the emerging economies. The agenda of G20 has also shifted to other subjects that are more urgent after COVID-19, but we think that we are going to resume the discussion because investment in quality infrastructure by the public sector and private sector is essential in the economic recovery of COVID-19.
And specifically when we talk about PPPs, we need to talk about risks and challenges. Again, being efficient so that we can ensure success is critical. But I think that we also need to focus on is the central role of the development bank. The private sector has a critical role to play in these PPPs, especially when it comes to a region. But Milagros, as you said, there's a lot on the legal side and a lot of limitations because of the pandemic, a lot of oversight issues. So the role of both sides is very important. So there's that clear interaction. We think that central and regional development banks can help with funding, guarantees, technical support, consulting, and they have a very important role to play in every aspect of the team. They can help with the legal frameworks. They can help with all of the aspects of a PPP so that it can be successful. Thank you so much.
Milagros, you're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maya. You mentioned something that was interesting. You need to have quality projects, and you have to limit the extra effort it takes to prepare the projects. You have to streamline it. So I'd like Christian to talk about it. Christian, sorry, you have led first infra label. You'll tell us a little bit more about this later. But this is a label that can help decide when infrastructure is sustainable or not sustainable. And this will influence private investment or interest in private investment in this. So how can we accelerate or contribute to sustainable infrastructure PPPs? How can we promote them? And in the case of Brazil, how this can be applied?
Thank you very much. I'll switch to English because it's going to be easier.
To participate in English. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to the Inter-American Development Bank and IDB Invest. So look, I'm not going to repeat what you said at the beginning very well, and what Maia has also been stressing, which is the importance of sustainable infrastructure, because it's really, I think, at the intersection of a couple of really important commitments for the next few decades, which is on building back better post-COVID, and also on the transition to net zero. So that's clear, and that's, I think, is well understood. But nevertheless, we face several very significant issues. I think one, and Maia, you just said that there are not enough bankable projects, especially in emerging and developing countries. Second, most of the infra assets and infra projects are actually pretty carbon heavy, which is really concerning because it's compromising the future progress and alignment with the Paris Agreement. Just for you to know, approximately 70% of global greenhouse gases emissions are coming from the building, the operation, and the maintenance of infrastructure assets across the world. So we're talking about 70% of GHG emissions here. The third issue that we have, in addition to the lack of bankability and carbon heaviness of projects, is the fact that institutional investors are actually pretty keen to invest in sustainable infra assets. They can offer, long-term, stable returns. They are real assets, but it's really difficult for most institutional investors to verify which assets are actually genuinely and certifiably sustainable, in addition to obviously having a potential to turning a profit. And this is really what those issues, and in particular the last one that we've been trying to solve with Fast Infra. So Fast Infra stands for finance to accelerate the sustainable transition with a focus on infrastructure. It's a public-private partnership, a collaborative initiative, a platform that we've been co-leading together with the IFC, together with the Global Infrastructure Facility, CPI, the OECD, Macquarie, and many others. It includes approximately 100 institutions, all the key stakeholders of the ecosystem of infrastructure. So financial institutions, development finance institutions, MDBs, institutional investors, NGOs, civil society, and so on and so forth. And the objective of FAST is to propose practical solutions and inclusive solutions to establish sustainable infra as an asset class, and to embed sustainability across the life cycle of the infra projects. And as part of the solutions that we have advanced, one is the label. So the label is something which did not exist. There were several definitions and frameworks, and the Inter-American Development Bank actually has done a lot of work on defining what sustainable infrastructure is, but there was no label like there is a green bond label, like there is a green building label with the LEED certification or BREEAM certification. There was nothing that would allow to establish the sustainability characteristics of and to evaluate the sustainability characteristic of an infra asset. So this is what we've done. During more than a year, we've been looking at all the different frameworks that exist, and we came up with the first label, which was launched in Glasgow at the beginning of the month of November. The label has been endorsed by leading coalitions of investors and sponsors, including the Glasgow Financial Alliance to Net Zero, GFANZ, including the Sustainable Markets Initiative, including various alliances of investors, altogether $130 trillion of assets, and also by coalitions of cities and regions like ICLE. So now that the label has been launched, we are road testing it, and I'm really happy to report that the first project under consideration is in Brazil. It's a public street lighting project that is developed in a public-private partnership with Caixa, with IFC, with the Global Infra Facility, with the World Bank, and various other stakeholders. And it's a project which is aiming to modernize with LED technology, the public street lighting of 10 cities in Brazil. It's something which, brought at scale, should be helping reduce emissions of CO2 by approximately 500,000 tons of CO2 per year. So a very significant impact on CO2 emissions, and an example of public-private partnership which is going to be using the label. I'll say more about the label in the second question.
Muchísimas gracias, Christian.
Thank you so much, Christian. I now like to ask David to talk about how the developers are looking at this. We see that sustainable infrastructure is increasingly more desirable for everybody, but we still hear a lot of comments. A lot of people say that it may lead to execution delays or deployment delays. It may complicate the process. It may be difficult. So if you could comment a little bit about how developers see this, and what are 2 or 3 main challenges that this type of projects face today. Thank you so much, Milagro, for the invitation. It is really a pleasure to be taking part in this group today, this panel discussion today. Let's start with the end. I think the challenges are interrelated. I think first, the humans' tendency to think short-term. Humans think short-term. And then also, traditional financial models are very limited in nature. And this is a mixture of risk and money over time. They mix it all up. And this creates a fictitious establishment that only favors short-term cash flows. And the use of these models, using these models, confirms our short-term points of view, the fact that we are short-termists by nature. So it feeds into itself. And now you asked the first question. I do agree that the biggest challenge we're facing is perception that sustainable projects are expensive and that they're going to take a long time to implement. Okay, perception is a problem. But sustainability is not properly carried out. The use of traditional models for funding make it difficult to help people invest in sustainable infrastructure, sustainable projects. We often don't look at the true benefits that we will get by reducing the risks brought by investing in this infrastructure. There are alternative methods available that might be able to address this issue. For example, I work for Geosyntec consultants. We have been developing a net present value. It's like an NPV type methodology. And we separate out the risk from the value of money over time. So it makes it explicit where the project costs lie. And risks are treated as separated as a line item. So the way we look at our risks, the way we think about our risks on a day-to-day basis, that we have to start thinking about our risks as costs, whether we pay for them or not. We need to think of them that way. You asked if we're changing the perspectives of sustainable projects and sustainable infrastructure projects. I don't think it matters if you're in the public-private sector or private sector. People are well-intentioned, and they do want to invest in this. A good example would be Coalition for Climate Resilience that has over 100 members and participants. It's an NGO. The IBD is one of the members, one of the members of this coalition. And everyone's working to develop tools that will offset climate change. I think our current models don't know how to include these physical risks in tangible risks in a financial model. And that would explicitly be able to that would help us a lot to take into account infrastructure resilient costs. So when we don't take into account all of these costs, and when we can take into all of these costs, perceptions will actually change. But we need to take in all of those costs and find a way to include them. Does that answer your question? Yes. Thank you, David. I'm glad that perception is changing, even though, as you said, we need a mindset shift in how we look at the risks and how we look at these financial models and how we consider all of these line items. That is absolutely critical. Christian, going back to you, investor community wants to invest in sustainable investments, increasingly more, not just in terms of climate change, but also socially speaking. So I would like you to tell us a little bit about how the investment community has changed and how you're seeing it's looking at sustainability and how that has changed over recent years.
Into the investment policies and guideline, not only of investors, but also of banks. And we've seen in Glasgow a mobilization of finance, which was unheard of. We had never seen that before. I mentioned G-Funds, for instance, which is committed to net zero by 2050, with 450 institutions across the world, approximately $130 trillion in assets, and all of them are integrating one way or another some sustainability objectives, whether it's climate related or whether it's social, gender, or any type of issues in the universe of ESG factors. Just to give you an example of the appetite for sustainable investment and infrastructure in particular, we at HSBC at the beginning of the year, we did a survey of investor attitude towards sustainable investment. We surveyed 1,000 institutional investors across the world, and we asked them whether they wanted to invest, they were interested in investing in sustainable infrastructure. And the answer was pretty interesting. About 25% of them do invest today in sustainable infrastructure, but an additional 50% are interested and are planning to invest in sustainable infrastructure over the next few years. But when you ask them what is holding them back, they say they have no idea about the sustainability criteria of these assets, whether the assets are genuinely sustainable. So we asked them whether they were comfortable with the sustainability characteristics of their infra assets. Only 8% said they were. And 80% said some type of label, some type of new methodology would help them, would give them much more security for their investment in sustainable infrastructure. So that's one of the reasons also why we are vindicated with the establishment of this label. The Fast Infra label has 4 dimensions, not only environment, not only climate, but it is environment, social governance, ESG, but also climate adaptation and climate resiliency. So we've worked very closely with CCRI, David is just mentioned, and the label refers to the work of CCRI and to the methodology developed by CCRI for the criteria related to climate resiliency and climate adaptation. So this is really the first multi-criteria label which has been launched, and we think this is going to facilitate investment decisions by the private sector. It will attract private financing. It will also facilitate due diligence processes and reduce the cost and frictions. I think Milagros, you mentioned at the beginning the cost and the inefficiency in project development. This is something that will help facilitate the development of those projects. And also it will encourage governments and sponsors to design infra projects with sustainability in mind. So it will help embed sustainability criteria in the assets, because they will know that the assets will be more bankable, that they will find a market, that it will be easier to finance, that quality projects will be easier to finance. So we think this is really an important step in the catalyzation of private investment for sustainable infra.
Muchas gracias, Cristian. Y esto me...
Thank you so much. And this helps me connect to the next question for David. We've been talking about sustainable infrastructure. What is sustainable infrastructure? Defining it. But I'd like to focus on specifically on PPPs. This is one of the best mechanisms to distribute risks. You have so much experience working with developers. What can the PPPs work with this, and what would you tell the governments so that they can jumpstart this process and we can have more PPPs focusing on this? And later we'll be talking about the implementation of this with our other panelists. Thank you so much for this question. I think you're right. PPPs should be the best vehicles to allocate risks for those who can manage the risks and handle the risks. Since the risks are not explicitly assessed, I think it's difficult to equally distribute this risk. Often it's not equitable. Under the traditional models, all the risks look at just one or two elements, so you really can't evaluate the risks, and you can't tell which elements, which parts are taking on which risks, which elements are responsible for which risk. And if we don't identify and quantify these risks explicitly as project costs and how they can be distributed and allocated, it's going to be very difficult to equally distribute those risks. Then there's another question about deployment. Often the government takes on more of the risk because they need the infrastructure, and that's not very equitable. That's not very fair. I think what we can do in the private sector is support these alternative models and try and include these better concepts of understanding the concepts of risk as part of the project costs. I think that is the only way. That is the only way to really assess benefits, to really change the model, to really... It's going to be a lot more... It means a lot more work. And it's very different from what we're used to doing. People don't like to do new things. They like to do what they've always done. But if we do this, we'll be able to better understand the project risks and understand the effects in financial assessments. So I think that Brazil is well positioned to do this because it's very familiar with financial create academic publications and a little bit of changes. We've seen this in the gas and petroleum, oil and gas, and a number of different sectors where they're starting to look at different ways of evaluating this risk and assessing this risk. I think Brazil's quite well positioned. I think it might be one of the drivers for this type of sustainable infrastructure investment as part of PPPs. And we hope that this can be helpful to other countries, other regions, and other PPPs. Thank you so much, David. Maia. Risk management, risk distribution is something that all the governments are thinking about. Christian also talked about this. Everyone's thinking about this. But if you could talk to us a bit about what are the governments thinking in terms of how to drive during COVID, how to drive these PPPs, how to support and encourage these PPPs? Everything was, we kept thinking about how we can do more resilient infrastructure, et cetera, and then the COVID came. So how do we change gear, change tack again? How do we support these PPPs? How are the different governments looking at how to encourage these PPPs? Or can you talk about some of the different models that you've seen, or a little bit about your experience, both in the Ministry of the Economy in Argentina and as part of the G20? Sure. Yes, a lot has changed. Looking at the risks has changed. Some priorities have changed. Both G20 and the country and regionally is that everyone understands that infrastructure is a priority. And it's important to promote investments in infrastructure projects. And especially right now as we're in the post-COVID recovery period, this is still more critical than ever. Through the global infrastructure for the GIF, which came out of the G20, we've seen with the country recovery plans and encouragements and with the stimulus packages, we've seen with millions of dollars, right? That the countries continue to have this tax incentives to focus in infrastructure. So there is this investment. This includes investment in transport, social, communications sectors. In fact, this corresponds to about more than 50% of the investments of the G20 countries. This is absolutely critical for countries' economic development. It's obviously important. Obviously, as the discussions are happening, there's a number of different opinions. Infrastructure, what does infrastructure mean? What does quality, sustainable infrastructure mean? So it's been hard to reach a total consensus. It also very much depends on each country's economic point where they are right now in economic development. Funding access for countries needs to be accessible. And that is also crucial. Countries need to have access to this funding. This is very important to overcome some of the gaps, the development gaps between countries and from capital cities to the rural areas of countries. And sadly, we've seen this more abruptly. I think it's been more stark during the pandemic. So in the region and in G20, we've seen a lot of discussion about how we can take into all of these elements into account. It's important that we work on. We've been hearing a lot about the topics that my colleagues mentioned. These have been a lot of talk about how we can encourage the government. How the private government or private sector can help governments reach their countries' development goals, how they can interact, how they can work together, where is the interaction point. And I think, obviously, sustainable infrastructure is one of the central pillars to making sure that that happens and that those goals are met. Sadly, we've seen with COVID, we've seen an increase in inequality, and this is the only way forward if we want to overcome some of these gaps. Social and inclusion infrastructure is absolutely critical in every aspect that we can imagine. We want to take advantage of the opportunities that this very difficult crisis has forced us to rethink about quality infrastructure and how we can invest and promote quality infrastructure. Thank you so much, Maya. This has been a very interesting discussion. We don't have that much time left, but we've reached some very interesting conclusions here. One, infrastructure development is clearly a priority of the G20 countries, not just in terms of climate change, but as you just said, there's a need to include the private sector, focus specifically on social infrastructure. Christian made it clear that there is a lot of appetite among investors to face these challenges and to help countries develop and address climate issues and be more efficient in these investments. But this is a new paradigm shift. We know that not all projects are bankable. We need to have clear criteria to define what is infrastructure, what is not infrastructure, and what is sustainable infrastructure, and not to confuse the investment community that wants to fund but doesn't really know what to trust. And we also need to know, how can we assess investments for investors? How can we assess risks? How can we assess the different funding models? Just a very quick round, one word or one phrase, the most important phrase or word, just leave a message for everybody today. Last line, last phrase, last comment. David, we're going to start with you. Thank you. Thank you, Milagros. I think what I want to tell everybody here today is all risks have prices, have a cost. We have to start think about things differently. Risks have costs, and we need to explicitly put it as a line item in the budget. And only then will we be able to really face the risks and distribute the risks. In terms of PPP, we're looking for much more resilient. We need to change. We had a paradigm shift in terms of investment assessment in order to have successful PPPs, investment PPPs. Maya, thank you. Go ahead. I really loved this discussion. I loved the different ideas and experiences that we've heard, both from the public sector, private sector, development banks. I think we can continue working together, continue developing not just PPPs, but ideas, and meet our main objective, which is have better quality infrastructure so that we can have a better economic life, so that we can better serve our populations. I think that's the focus. This is the only way to get over and overcome this crisis, is this focus on investment and not lose sight of the objective, which is helping the populations through these PPPs. Christian.
Because I believe, not only it's a priority of the G20, but it has become also a priority of the G7. It's a priority of the various alliances, financial institutions, asset owners, and so on and so forth. And there is a lot of focus today in the world about, the creation of those public-private partnerships allowed to mobilize finance at scale. So I think, I'm pretty enthusiastic. I think we need to think about it in a holistic way, and we've been saying that during the whole panel, looking at the supply side and also the demand side of sustainable infra projects. And I think that's where institutions like the Global Infra Facility are really important for project preparation and others. And we need to think about scalability because it's all about scale. So what are the solutions that can allow to mobilize at scale, to develop infra projects at scale, and that can be replicable across the world because it's a global challenge. And I think that's some of the issues, the solutions that we've been proposing address those issues of scalability and global application and replicability.
Muchísimas
Thank you so much to all three of you. It has really been an honor to have this discussion with all of you. It has been really enriching. And to all of you who are listening, I hope that you have enjoyed this. I think working together, we'll be able to find solutions for scalability, just like Christian just mentioned, and sustainable infrastructure development projects through PPPs. I think we'll be able to achieve it. Thank you so much.